This is a real treat. This is my second time to go live on LinkedIn this week. So I went live yesterday as well. I've got my lovely guest today, Lindsay Recknell, from episode 72 of the Happier at Work podcast, where we spoke about burnout. We spoke about mental health at work and psychological safety and how to create that sense of psychological safety around those mental health discussions. And I know certainly burnout was one of those kind of hot topics, if you like, that people were very interested in and could really relate to. At the closing of the podcast, in the kind of wrap-up summary that I do every week, I spoke about my own experience where I haven't directly experienced burnout to the extent that like I had to take a massive break or I had to go to hospital or anything like that. From what I understand burnout to be, I haven't suffered from burnout as such, but I most certainly have been close. And as I explained when I was talking about that situation, the temptation always is to continue and just to keep plowing on through it, you know, and like, oh, I'll just get this one more thing done. And, you know, until you reach such a stage where I think, Lindsay, you described it as you just have no more cares left to give. You just kind of get to that stage. Lindsay, before we go any further, would you like to introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background? And then we can talk maybe a little bit more about the podcast and cover some of the topics in a very top line level.
Yeah, I sure can. So thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about burnout, which is a terrible thing to have to talk about, you know? So I'm Lindsay Recknell. I am a workplace mental health specialist, a podcaster, and an expert in hope. So the work that I do is with organizations helping to normalize mental health conversations in the workplace. I want to make mental health conversations as non-awkward and as normalized as any other conversation at work. Mm-hmm. You know, we should be able to bring our whole selves to work. And I want to help organizations and the humans that work in those organizations get through the barrier, the mental barrier of not wanting to have what they perceive as awkward conversations when really they're just conversations about your life.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I have seen such a shift at work from even in the last 3 years since I left corporate life, but certainly in the last 10 years, the kinds of discussions that are going on. And it always is a scary prospect, either being the recipient of that type of conversation where you didn't think that it was going to go, or being the kind of giver of that conversation, or having that, you know, having to broach the subject with the manager or with one of your peers or something like that. I think the perception is that it's going to be quite difficult. And especially, you know, and you shared some of your own experiences where you might have some managers who are very positive and helpful and supportive, and other managers who just don't want to know, really.
Yeah, who are awkward on the receiving end of those conversations, let alone creating a space to have those conversations. I have to tell you about my own personal experience just this week, really quickly. I mean, we're a half an hour going late going live because I slept in, because this is Thursday, and on Monday I tipped over that edge into not enough cares left to give. My husband came home from work and found me in the fetal position on our bed. Like it got to be too much. And so the rest of the week I've been trying to give myself grace for that experience, recognizing that I'm supposed to be an expert at these things, you know, and I have not been walking the talk. I have been taking on too much and doing too many things. And I tipped over the limit. And so this week I'm giving myself grace to sleep in a little bit longer, not past interview time slots, by the way, but, you know, and just to truly to recharge and get back to that place of doing all the things, but at a much more manageable level.
I mean, that's easily done. So totally forgivable. And it's great that you're giving yourself that sense of grace. And like, the first thing that springs to mind when you share that story was it's so easy to teach people about it, but it's more difficult to do it ourselves. And as a coach, I can most certainly resonate with that. Like, you don't always take the advice, and sometimes the advice, or as a coach, you're not supposed to be giving advice, but you're probing questions, and they're coming up with their own solutions. But you're there as a guide, essentially, and as the guide, you always think that you should be able to apply this stuff to your own life quite easily, but it's not that easy. Even when it's kind of, knocking on your head but I suppose maybe let's take a step back and think about, how do we put ourselves in those kinds of situations? I know for me, it is the saying yes. It's feeling a sense that I should do this and I should do this. And there's so many things, especially given that it's me in the business. I have a level of support from external people who are contracted out, but for the most part, it's me in the business and I'm doing everything. And I recently started a marketing program, and I'm looking through, part of it is looking at all the tasks that need to be done in the business now and in the future, and how that might turn into a specific role, for example. So I was looking through all the tasks, and I knew that there was a lot to do in the business, but like putting it down on paper like that, it just blew me away. It really, really did, like, just how much work I have to do. And it is about setting clear boundaries and saying no, I think.
Well, and that sense of overwhelm, for me, for sure, is what sends me over the top. It is thinking of all those things that I have to do. So I find the thing that works for me is to make sure I take care of my physical health, because I know what an impact that has on my mental health. So I ride my bike every morning. And I know for a fact that when I don't prioritize riding my bike, the rest of my day is nonsense. Like, I do not operate at my best. I pretend that I do, but I definitely don't show up as my best self. And I can't work as well. I'm not as productive. I'm not as patient, any of those things. And so I absolutely have to take care of my mental health, or my physical health, which hugely contributes to my mental health. And I think people sometimes get that backwards. We think that our physical health is more important than our mental health, but I actually think our mental health contributes so positively to our physical health, because when I'm, it's that catch-22. If I don't ride, my mental health is terrible. And if my mental health is terrible, I won't ride. So
it's a chicken and egg kind of, isn't it? Because I remember, I have a very clear recollection of when I lived in London, and I would come home after a long day of work feeling really tired, really exhausted. I didn't want to go for a run, or I didn't want to go for a swim. And my flatmate said, do you remember the last time you came home and you said you didn't want to go for a run, or you didn't want to go for a swim, and you went out and did it anyway, because mentally you're exhausted, but physically you haven't maybe reached that stage yet. But you go out, you do that, and you just feel revitalized. It makes such a difference.
Huge difference. Well, I think so. The thing that really works for me is the routine and habit. If you can make those things, routine and habit, just something you do that your brain doesn't have to think about, that is no question, you're just going to do. It leaves you energy, decision-making energy for the stuff that actually matters. So if you know that when you get home, you just go and put on your shoes and you go out, and that there's nothing else you can do at that time. Your brain's designed to be efficient. So if you can take decision-making opportunity away from your brain, it just gives it so much more energy to do the other things that are really important. And you get the bonus of getting the exercise and all the benefit of the exercise without even thinking about it too.
Yeah, I'm sure, I've read a few books on habits. The one that sticks in my mind is Atomic Habits by James Clear, but I'm sure he touches on that about taking decisions away. So, I mean, it can come down to something, I was going to say something simple, but it's not necessarily that simple, but like things like meal planning in advance. So you don't have to decide what you're going to have to eat, or you might cook in advance, batch cooking, and so it's ready for you. I did some calculations today that I'm on day 189 of walking every day. So I started the year doing the 100 days of walking. There was the hashtag 100 days of walking challenge on Twitter. I got to 100 days and I thought, well, I'm enjoying this so much, I'm going to continue. And exactly as you described, Lindsay, like I don't even think about it anymore. It's just a given. And previously it would have been like, I don't really feel like it, or it's raining, you know, typical in Ireland, of course. Or it's dark, you know, in the wintertime when it was dark and cold in the evenings, I still went and did it, and was really proud of myself for doing it.
Totally.
And now it's a bit easier because it's the summertime now, so it's most certainly easier to get out there and do it. So we kind of talked on some of the factors leading up, and one element of the factors to alleviate, to manage burnout, to recover from burnout. And we certainly talk about a lot more steps on the podcast. So if anyone wants to know more about that, they can tune into the full episode, and the link is below in the comments section. The other thing, Lindsay, that we spoke about was this idea, and you know, an area that you're a huge advocate for, is having those discussions about mental health at work and creating that psychologically safe environment for people to, I mean, just the thoughts of that is very intimidating. So where do we even start to have those conversations?
Well, and isn't it the thing? I mean, we know how much better we feel when we talk out loud, but what the heck do we say? How do we even start those conversations? And I mean, it could be as easy as going into your boss's office or your colleague's office and saying, hey, I don't feel myself today. And it could be as easy as that, or maybe that's awkward for you. So some of the things that I talk about in my workshops, and we talked about on the podcast, open those doors by referencing someone else. You know, fortunately, we have lots of people talking in the media and on TV, and I guess that's media, about their mental health experiences. So if you reference somebody else's experience and how that had an impact on you, or how it resonated with you, it's an easy way to open the door to your own personal experience. You know, you could also ask questions of your colleague or your leader, whoever it is that you're speaking to. You know, have you ever felt undervalued? Have you ever felt that you have no cares left to give? And, ask them and then respond to their response. You know, so then you start to have a conversation that way, where you aren't asking, you're not telling right away what you're feeling, but you're asking for their opinion or their mentorship. That goes a long way as well. And then if you're on the receiving end of those conversations, I think that's something we also forget to talk about, is when you're on the receiving end of those conversations, hear them, be present, you know, ask curious questions, open or receive it with no judgment. You don't know what the experience is like for them, and you may have a similar experience, but it's not likely to be the same. So don't imply that you know what they're going through. Even though you might, the experience is going to be very, very different. And so right up front, just hear them, just hold the space for them, and stay curious and open, and no judgment to what it is that they're feeling. Because honestly, if it matters to them, it matters. Even if you don't think it's a big deal, if it matters to them, it matters. Full stop.
Yeah. And you don't get to decide what matters to someone else.
At all.
Lindsay, one of the really great questions that came out of the conversation, or that was brought up in the conversation, was, how has the pandemic been for you? Which I think is really powerful, because, you know, there's a lot of talk of we're all in this together, or we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. But just getting a sense of, like, what has it meant for people? And it's a really great conversation opener if you haven't asked people yet. And there's probably some people who I'd love to know what it's been like for them, but I haven't had that opportunity. And maybe it feels a bit cliche, it feels a bit insincere or something, but I genuinely am curious about what the pandemic has been like for people, because it hasn't been the same for everyone. I think I mentioned several times on the podcast, I live by myself. So it's maybe been a different experience for me than it has been for someone. I know certainly my friends who have kids and things like that, it's been really stressful for them, you know, trying to manage the homeschooling and just being around their spouse all day, I think, has been quite stressful in itself as well. No, I'm not going to mention any names. But yeah, so just getting an understanding. Something we touched on towards the end of the podcast as well, and we we sort of briefly spoke about on this live broadcast was this idea of boundaries and setting clear boundaries. Do you want to share a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really, really important for what we're talking about as well.
I think it's almost the most important part of all of it. The idea of setting boundaries, when you set boundaries well, when you figure out what they are, when you set them, when you communicate them, and then when you maintain them, that is a significant stress reducer. The thing is that identifying, setting, communicating, and maintaining is super stressful. And so if you can get through and, make an intentional effort to figure out what those boundaries are for you, to communicate them, because if people cross your boundaries, but you haven't told them what they are, that's on you,
Yes.
At least the first time. So, but if you can do those things and establish those boundaries and then maintain them and figure out a way to continuously maintain them, that is so stress reducing, because you're not worried all the time about your identity and what matters to you, because you figured that all out. And by setting your boundaries, you figured out, where you begin or where you end and others begin, because that's often the challenge for people is when people are crossing your boundaries, it's getting into your space. It's taking over your time. It's, taking away your own sense of agency or your own sense of control. And so when you set those boundaries, that adds that layer of agency and control, which contributes to increased mental wellness and overall workplace mental health. I mean, boundary setting at work is something we don't talk about, and absolutely would be instrumental in increasing wellness at work.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's like, to me, it is fundamental. And sometimes we assume that people know that they're crossing boundaries because it's something that bothers us so much. We assume that it's going to bother someone else a lot, and they're doing it deliberately. They're doing it to get a rise out of us. They're doing it to annoy us in some way. And sometimes we ourselves have a tendency, like we could kind of overstep the boundaries or take personal responsibility for other people's behavior and things like that. So there's certainly a lot to discuss around that area of boundaries. And, if people want to know more, we have discussed in more detail on the podcast. Lindsay, is there anything else that you'd like to share today? Talk about your own podcast or anything else about how people can connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So I actually have a 2 workshop series on burnout and boundaries. They are standalone, but they also work really, really well together, because I believe that boundaries is a way to stop the slide into burnout. So it's super popular. Absolutely the number one thing that I get to talk about these days, which is pretty great. I have a organization called Mental Health in Minutes, which is all about helping organizations connect with their people to normalize workplace mental health conversations. We will give you all of the content, all of the research, all of the presentations, everything you need to do to have those conversations. Then we'll teach you how to have them, and it'll raise collective wellness in your organization. So you can find us at Mental Health in Minutes on all the places. That's also the name of one of my podcasts. So we on the podcast, we talk about strategies and the mechanisms to support leaders and HR people and learning and development and safety people on how to increase wellness at work in a real strategic, practical way. And then my other podcast is called Hope Motivates Action, where I talk about positive psychology and the science of hope, and how everyone, us normal everyday people, are using hope to motivate action in their lives.
Love that. I just love the entire concept of that, of being hopeful. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your time on the podcast as well. I haven't seen any questions pop up live. If anyone is watching the replay and you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat below, and myself and Lindsay will be happy to interact with you. So thank you so much for your time today.
It has been my absolute pleasure, Aoife. It's so great to hang out with you. So thanks very much.
Thank you.